2 Chronicles chapter 9. My oldest son, Isaiah, he was telling me that he had a friend come up to him at school and he said, "Isaiah, do you know that gullible's not in the dictionary?" And he said, "No, it is. Actually, it's in there twice." And his friend said, "Really?" I love good humor. I love quick wit. I love that. And I love wisdom. I love when you can go to somebody and get good counsel. You know, when somebody who just has that wisdom to know what to do in a situation. You know, maybe you're going through something or you have some problem or something like that, and you have somebody that you can go to with that type of problem. I have a mentor that's kind of like that, and he's just one of those guys. He used to, back when he was younger, in his 70s, he would hold these pastors' meetings. And all these pastors from all over, I mean, hundreds of pastors would seek this guy out for counsel. And I was fortunate enough to be in one of his groups where there was probably half a dozen of us. You know, in his Boise group, there was like 200 guys that would show up. In Caldwell, there was just a few of us. And so we really got to sit and just talk with him and go through weird books together, books I would never read on my own. But he just had this sage wisdom. And I remember one time there was a pastor who was asking him about a friend of his. And he said, you know, there's this guy and he was in prison. And he would, you know, in prison, he was teaching Bible studies. He got a seminary degree. He was kind of like a pastor in prison. And he'd get out of prison. And he says, last time we moved him into our house. And, you know, and he would go and he'd get drunk. And he'd get behind the wheel of a car, and then he'd get arrested, and he gets thrown right back in prison. It's like in prison he's doing great, but the second he gets out, the guy's just like off the rails. And he asked my mentor, David Roper, he said, "David, you think that guy's even saved?" And David, he said, you know, if you had a son, and he had it all together, but he didn't need you, he was independent, had no need for you, would you prefer that, or would you prefer a son who struggled a little bit, and because of his struggles, he clung to you? And I thought, wow, I never would have thought of it that way. But, you know, and he just says, you know, sometimes God just doesn't take away all of our vices or all of our problems. Sometimes he leaves one so that in that problem we continue to come to him. And I was thinking about that in my own life, man. It's the problems that make me go to God, right? But just wisdom like that. Or other mentors I've had, you know, when it comes to things like planning a church and things like that, and they just say, you know, don't focus on all those things, you know, just focus on these simple things, you know, and what a difference it made, you know, just to have guys to come alongside of you and kind of clarify it for you, you know, and nothing like wisdom to take everything and cut it to the simplicity of the matter. I remember one time I went to a guy he was one of my pastors, and he was actually in charge of the ministry that I was leading at Calvary, Boise, and he went and planted a church a year before I did. And so I went to him and I said, "Dan, how do you start a church?" And he just looked at me and he said, "Mike, you know, it's kind of like Nike. You just do it." And I don't know what it was about that little piece of advice, that little piece of wisdom, you know, they stole from Nike, but it was the simplicity of it that made it doable. It's like, oh yeah, you know, of course, just do it. You know, don't worry about all the minutia of everything. But wisdom in this world can be hard to come by, can't it? You know, there's no end to advice. And if you want to see sheer folly, just turn on the news and listen to those guys. And I don't care which channel you turn to, it's just ridiculous. You know, and the world is not a place where wisdom is easily gleaned. And yet the Bible would say, in fact Solomon himself would write in Proverbs chapter 4, wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and in all you're getting, get understanding. He would say of wisdom, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So here we find Solomon in all of his wisdom. It tells us that it is important to get wisdom. And then he tells us how to get wisdom. He says it starts by fearing the Lord. By looking at God, realizing He is God, I am not. I am weak, He is strong. You know, that's a hard one, isn't it? I remember one time I was singing that to my 5-year-old. He was, I think, 3 at the time. I said, okay, Xander. Yes, Jesus loves me. We are weak, but he's strong. He's like, no, he's weak. I'm strong. I'm like, oh, buddy. But that's how we are. You know, we want to be strong. And yet God says, no, you're weak. To fear him, to put him in his proper perspective, the proper context to where he is and where we are. And so this message, as we look at Solomon, we're going to look at the wisdom side of Solomon. We have to understand that for all of Solomon's wisdom, and we really see the apex of Solomon's wisdom reading through the book of Ecclesiastes. And Solomon kind of draws out his conclusion, the conclusion of his life, what he learned after getting and obtaining everything he absolutely could have lusted after or desired after or sought after. And what's amazing about Solomon is just the duplicity of this man's life as he, with wisdom for the first 20 years of his life, would build the Lord's temple, would build his house, would establish his kingdom and grow it. And the wisdom would continue throughout his kingdom, but on the other side of things, he had 1,000 wives. Well, 700 wives and 300 concubines. I don't even know what the point of that is. You know, it just seems ridiculous. Talk about folly. And it would be those things, those relationships with these different wives and concubines that would lead him astray. And in his life, he would seek after false gods, worship false gods, even Molech, where he would let some of his sons pass through the fire. You know, it's almost, as you look at Solomon's life, it was almost as though he was just like, I'm not going to attach myself to any of this, but I'm just going to experience all of it. And I think some people find that in their lives, and that's what they try. And it's almost like Solomon was just this human disgusting experiment where he was just going to try everything and just to prove that none of it satisfied. Somebody's got to do it, right? We have the same folly, don't we? We have the same mentality. Every single one of you, if I say, how many of you would like to win the lottery? You might say no, but deep inside you're like, I'd like to have $1 million just to see what it's like. And yet we know, because we're wise enough to know and we've seen enough, that most of us understand $1 million would ruin us. Actually, that's not that much anymore. $100 million would ruin us. I guess $1 million would just pay the bills, pay our house off, and then we have nothing anymore. No, but the reality is with Solomon, he came to this conclusion after all the folly of his life that we need to fear God. And that was the conclusion, and we're going to look at that as we look at his life here. But interesting, Solomon would be sought after for his wisdom, and that was something that began to be spread as he's getting into the middle of his reign, about 20 years in. It starts to get out that Solomon has unusual and spectacular wisdom. And so it says in verse 1, now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions, having a very great retinue. Retinue, that's a company of counselors is what that means. Retinue, camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. We don't know a whole lot about the Queen of Sheba. There's some differing historical accounts, but most of the evidence points that she was actually the queen of the Ethiopians, and Sheba just meant the queen of the south, as Jesus will call her in Matthew chapter 12. And so this queen, the queen of Ethiopia, historically, we know that she went to Solomon, and the Ethiopians have a history that from the time that their queen went to Solomon until the time of Jesus, they practiced a form of Judaism. Like the entire country practiced a form of Judaism, which converted after the Ethiopian eunuch, who was the attendant to the Queen of Sheba, or Candace at that time, came and brought Christianity to them. And of course, very wealthy and very prominent, and that's why the Ethiopian eunuch was the attendant of the Queen Candace, was in Jerusalem worshiping, because he was a practicing Jew, and he would obtain there a scroll of Isaiah that would have him reading that as he's reading the scroll. And of course, Philip the evangelist overtakes the chariot and leads the man to Christ, baptizing him there, and then disappearing. And that man, the Ethiopian eunuch, going down to Ethiopia and spreading the gospel there. And so there's a rich history here when it comes to this story. And then it just kind of carried through the history of Ethiopia. And they've been worshipers of God, this country, for a very, very long time, since the time of Solomon, according to tradition. But here's a woman who isn't finding satisfaction in the gods of the people that she worships, the fathers that her fathers worshipped. Not finding satisfaction, looking for answers. Here's a woman with a lot of questions. I don't know if you've ever met somebody who has a lot of questions. Some of the kids in this church have a lot of questions. And they come up with great questions. I think it was Jackson the other day came up to me and he had an amazing question. Question I've been pondering myself. There's all these questions we have in life. And this queen has these questions. She's not finding answers in the counselors that she has. She's not finding answers in the books that she's reading or having read to her. And so she hears of this man, Solomon, and the wisdom that he has. And so she tries to go check it out. And it says, so Solomon, verse 2, answered all of her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain it to her. Now, what kind of questions does a queen have? I suppose somebody who's a ruler would have a question of, how do I rule these people? But I think that if you were to probe into the mind of a queen, you would find that she has the same questions that everybody has. Why do good people suffer while bad people prosper? What is the meaning of this life? Is there more to life than I'm experiencing? What do I do with the guilt of my sin? Is there a God? And if there's a God, is he a good God? And if there is a good God, does he care about me? Or is he completely indifferent to my situation? And if there is a loving God, what is the purpose of my life? I think we all ask these questions at times. And you can imagine she's coming to Solomon with all these questions, and it says he answers every question. No question was too hard for him. Now, I don't know about you, but I had a lot of questions about life, and I had a lot of theories about life as a young man. Crazy theories. And I sat with a lot of people, and even, I think probably a lot of that comes out, stupidly when you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing, drinking something you're not supposed to be drinking, or smoking something you're not supposed to be smoking, and you talk about the deep philosophical things of life, and you think you have come to some answer. You're talking about aliens and weird stuff, And you're thinking, man, we got it all figured out. Then you wake up in the morning with a headache and okay, I don't think I have anything figured out. My life is going nowhere. And it just intensifies the questions man, what is with me? And then, at some point, hopefully all of us have come to this point where we realize my life really is going nowhere. Everything I've tried to bring satisfaction to my heart, to fulfill me in some way, has just left me empty, ruined, and wasted, and there has to be something more. And so we seek out wisdom. We seek out, is there really a God? I remember that day when it was my turn. I remember I was listening to the radio station, Christian radio station, and that guy saying, it doesn't matter where you've been or what you've done. Jesus can forgive all of your sins if you'll just believe that he died on the cross for you, that he was buried and rose from the grave. And I thought, could that be true? Yeah, I don't know if I even want to believe that. It's too good to be true. Could it be true that if I just believe that Jesus died for me, That I could have forgiveness of sins? Do you realize where I've been? Do you realize what I've done? He's saying, it doesn't matter where you've been or what you've done. And I remember getting down on my knees, humbling myself and saying, okay, God, if that's true, if it's true that even I could be forgiven. I remember thinking that if even I could be forgiven, I want that. I want that for me. And what a miracle would take place after that. Solomon had all this wisdom, had all this understanding, had all the answers to all of her questions. Could you imagine having that kind of wisdom? Where would we get that kind of wisdom? Is that even available to anybody today? Is there anybody like Solomon who has wisdom like that? Well, of course. It's found in Jesus, right? And I love, one of my favorite passages, and actually one of my life verses, I think, because I depend upon it every day because of what I have to do for a living and what I have to do as a ministry, is James chapter 1. And you probably know of James chapter 1. It says, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. If he asks without doubting, for the man who doubts is like the wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. Let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. And so we have this promise that's amazing. It's conditional, but it's amazing. And God would say through James to the church, the 12 tribes scattered abroad, and anyone who would believe on Jesus, those who are in God through Jesus Christ, that if you will ask God for wisdom, He gives to all men liberally and without being angry with you, not without reproaching you, without like, why are you so stupid, you know? He gives it to you. And I love the qualification for that. What's the qualification for receiving wisdom? No, the qualification. What qualifies you? Yeah, you ask, but what qualifies you? Lack. I lack wisdom. So I'm qualified to have some. And yes, I do have to believe. So I ask and I believe. If I don't have any wisdom, then I can ask. If I guess I'm super wise, I don't need to ask. But if you don't have wisdom, ask God, who gives to all men liberally and without reproach. But ask without doubting. So in other words, if I ask God for wisdom and I believe He's going to give it to me, I will have it. It's unconditional, except for the doubting part. And as long as I don't doubt, as long as I trust God, then I have what He has for me. And so this is amazing because, we look at Solomon, we think about, having all this wisdom and being able to answer all these questions, and yet we have the same thing available to us through Jesus Christ. And so it goes on, it says in verse 3, and when the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters, their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, and his entryway by which he came up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. In other words, it knocked the wind out of her. She was blown away. And we use all these colloquialisms. That's theirs. There was no more spirit in her. Knocked the wind out of her. Blew her away. She was baffled. She saw everything, the way it was designed, the beauty, the functionality, the intricacy. Just how spectacular it was. And it was, I don't know if you've ever bought a tool or something like that, and you're like, of course, this is how every tool should work, It's one of those things where everything is designed. I mean, you've driven something, or you've worked on something, or you've experienced something that was built completely wrong. Have you guys ever experienced that? You have the thing is no ergonomic, there's no thought really in the way it was designed. Its functionality is poor. And on the other hand, you have something that's just engineered precisely. And this is the way that she saw, not just the way that things were designed, the height of the steps and the distance of this or that, or even the way that the people were dressed. And she could see not just, oh, everybody looks real nice, but there is a pattern and a design and a purpose for every single thing that is happening here. She could see Solomon's wisdom. I see why he put those people over there, or why they sit over there. And I understand now why, and she just saw the organization of it all. And she was speechless, undone. Verse 5, she said to the king, it was true, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. So over 1,200 miles this woman would have traveled. Now, you think about it, Queen of Ethiopia, Queen of Sheba. Sounds, we hear Queen of Sheba and we think, big time, right? Here's a lady who didn't go to see people. People came to see her. She was a queen. She didn't make trips. But here she is so desperate for wisdom and so yearning in her heart, and the fame of Solomon is so great that she makes a 1,200-mile journey to go see this guy. 1,200 miles. I think of people that are like this today. Is there anybody like this today? That people would travel that far, go through that much drama to go and see somebody? Ravi Zacharias, that guy, think about it. He goes to a university, a place, UC Berkeley or wherever. It doesn't matter how liberal the college is or how anti-God the professors are. He goes to that place and there's standing room only in every auditorium that he goes to. It's amazing. I went and saw him in Boise. The tickets were sold out in 10 seconds. For the governor's prayer breakfast. Ravi Zacharias is coming. I was there. How did I get a ticket? Well, because the radio station bought me one. I was like, okay, that's awesome, So I'm sitting there listening to Ravi Zacharias. What a privilege. But the guy's just so wise, And he answers questions with such love and compassion, and yet with such wisdom. And it doesn't matter what any of these educated kids, they're super smart kids that got into MIT or into Harvard or into Yale, and there's Ravi Zacharias, and these kids come up to the microphone and they ask these difficult questions. One question that was asked of Ravi Zacharias was, a woman asked him, why do Christians accept diversity in race and yet oppose diversity in sexuality? She said, that's one thing I never did understand about Christians. And he said, well, you see, we believe, as Christians, we believe that a person's race is sacred because God created them to be that way. God created them to be African or Indian or whatever. In God, they are created in the image of God, and we believe that the identity of a person is sacred. But he said, also we believe that God created somebody's sexuality to be sacred. And the way he created you was his design and the way he intended it to be. And so when we violate that through racism or gender confusion, then we violate the sovereignty of God's choice. As how does a guy come up with an answer like that? Just like that, So beautiful, such a complex question, such a difficult question. And yet with such grace, he answers these questions. And the queen would travel 1,200 miles to hear answers like this from Solomon, from difficult questions, no doubt. Verse 6, it says, however, she's continuing to tell Solomon this, however, I did not believe their words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half of the greatness of your wisdom was not told me. You exceed the fame of which I heard. And so here's this woman, she's a seeker. She's not just going to take anyone's word for it. And this is noble. that she would hear of this, she would say, I didn't even believe it. I didn't even believe it. Have you ever experienced that? I think that we all are a little bit skeptical. I think that there's things in our lives that we're just like, no. Somebody tells us a story of a miracle that happened to them, and we're like, really? You know, it's hard sometimes to believe. You know, and oftentimes we have to experience things for ourselves in order for us to believe things. I had that experience reading this book one time. And I think that if I wouldn't have had the experiences that I had, I would have said, this book is hogwash. There's no way this is true. There's no way that what he is positing in this book could possibly be anywhere close to reality. And yet, as I read it, I was blown away. I mean, it was the most profound thing, one of the most profound things I've ever read in my life. It was a book called Eternity in Their Hearts by Don Richardson. And the only reason I didn't just look at that and be like, nah, was because I had read several other books, several other testimonies that told the same story. And that is, and this is the story, that in his hypothesis in this book, I guess you could say, is that God has placed eternity, has placed a key or a witness into every culture of the world. And he gave story after story how God would send people to these foreign places, and you know the men would get there, and the Indians, wherever they were, the indigenous peoples, wherever they were, in China or in Burma or in South America or Africa, that they would have these traditions. Someday a white man is going to come to us with a book, and he's going to help us to know God again. Hundreds of cultures like that. They just believed that God was going to send somebody, and they were going to find God again. And many of them even having the story of the flood, you know, their whole ancestry all the way back to the flood. And telling these stories about this God, and all of them had the name from their ancient worship, this name of, and it wasn't the same name, every culture, every language is different, of course, but they had a name of a God who was the creator of everything, that their ancestors used to worship before they got hooked up into demon worship or animism. And so this it's throughout all culture. In fact, it would start out with even Paul going to Athens and that whole situation. Remember in Acts chapter 17 where Paul goes to Athens and he is talking on the Areopagus about the unknown God. And he says, I see that you guys are very religious and your city is full of gods, but I want to talk to you about the unknown God. I saw an altar to the unknown God, and this is the God I'm preaching to you. This is the God I'm speaking to you about. Now, you would think that Paul's just trying to be clever and using a local illustration. But what we didn't know, probably as a first-time Bible reader, was that there was a man 600 years before by the name of Epimenides, who was a prophet of sorts, kind of like Balaam was a prophet. And he went to Athens because they were experiencing a plague that was brought on because the king of Athens had committed treachery against the king of Macedonia. Plato and Aristotle both write about this. And so they invited a Cretan by the name of Epimenides to come to Athens to consult them with his wisdom on how to deal with this plague. And so he instructs them to make altars to an unknown God, since they don't know the God's name whom they've offended, and to sacrifice to him. And when they did, the plague stopped. And so they left an altar to the unknown God. And so Paul says, this is the God I'm talking to you about. And they would have all known this was the God that stopped the plague. And then he quotes Epimenides. For as one of your own prophets has said, for in him we live and move and have our being, for we are his offspring. And I'd have never known that. It's crazy, but Paul understood this about the culture, and he used that to share the gospel with them. And so too, missionaries from all over the world would go to places, and they would say, they go to Indians, and the Indians would say, we've been waiting for you. The sky god came to us and told us that you were coming, and that we were supposed to listen to you. And the missionaries would lead them to Jesus. Crazy stuff. See, I told you, it's unbelievable, right? And yet, I'd read Bruce Olson. It's a very similar story. I've read James Frazier's Mountain Rain. I'd read Don Richardson's Peace Child and The Lords of the Earth that Don Richardson also wrote. All these different stories that corroborated, and others among that, that corroborated this whole thing. Another one was, what's that book? Beyond the Golden Shore, Adoniram Judson. That's a thick one if you have time. Shannon and I are still working on it. It's been about 10 years. We've been reading that book. You get a ways, and then you're like, I can't do anymore. And you go a little bit farther, and okay, that's it. But you know what I'm saying? The whole thing is just amazing. You wouldn't believe it had you not heard it yourself. And so she feels with Solomon as she is hearing his wisdom. Actually, we bought some of those Eternity in Their Hearts books, so that's why I'm telling you about it. So I'll sell a few. Just kidding. No, it's an amazing book. Okay. Anyway. So, she finds Solomon to be wise. She said, I wouldn't have believed it had I been told. I'd only heard half of it, and I didn't even believe what I heard, and I've only been told half of how wise you really are. Yeah, I don't know where you were in your life when you came to Christ, or how much stock you put in the reality of how God could change your life or save you or forgive you. I remember thinking, I just need something. Something's got to change. My life is going nowhere. Nothing satisfies. And I remember coming to Jesus and how overwhelmed I felt, how forgiven I felt, the peace that I felt. I remember experiencing this, I guess you could say, even though this would seem like a negative thing, a conviction of sin. I never realized how bad, I knew I was a sinner, but I never realized how bad of a sinner I was until I became a Christian. And then I was just like, man, I have so much wrong with me. I remember, I don't know, you guys ever do this when you first got saved? You go through that period where you're like, okay, all day long, I'm not going to sin. I'm going to go all day without sinning. Did you try that? Yeah, how'd that work? And you're just like, I just need to be better, and you're crying out to the Lord, and He's meeting you. And you're messed up, but He still spends time with you for some reason. And it's crazy, and I don't know about you, but I could say, of all the things I heard about being a Christian, all the things I heard about what I could experience as a believer in Jesus Christ, I wasn't even told the half of it. How wonderful He really is. And the more I know Him, the more wonderful He becomes in my life. And the closer I press into Him, and in His presence is fullness of joy. And at His right hand, pleasures forevermore. It is nearness to Him that brings satisfaction in life. It's nearness to Him that brings wisdom. It's nearness to Him that brings peace and meaning and fulfillment in life. And outside of Him, nothing satisfies. I don't know how much I can emphasize that, but I've tried to satisfy myself outside of the Lord as a Christian as well as not as a Christian, and nothing satisfies. Everything is empty outside of a relationship with Jesus. But He truly does satisfy. And in fact, I've shared this before, but I found in my life that the only way I can really enjoy anything is if I enjoy Jesus first. And if I'm enjoying Him in my life, then everything's enjoyable. If I'm not enjoying Him, everything's a burden, even the good things. And that's just the reality. And so she sees this. She hears Solomon's wisdom. She sees the wisdom that he has and just the way he's organized everything and built everything and designed everything. And she says this, verse 7, happy are your men and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. I remember even as a young kid, I just love those stories where somebody just says something super wise or super witty or whatever. And to hear the story of Solomon, where the woman, these two women, had one woman rolled over on her baby and it died, and so she traded the other lady's baby and she pretended like that baby was her baby. And so they bring the baby before Solomon. And he says, they're both saying, "This is my baby." "No, it's my baby. It's my baby." "No, it's my baby." And he says, "Cut the baby in half. Give half to each of them." And immediately the mother says, "No, give the baby to her." And the other one's like, "No, cut it in half." And he says, that's the mother right there. And they gave the baby to the mother. Wisdom. I love that. I love that. Just to know that would work, just beautiful. But these people, she's saying, these guys get to sit here day in and day out. Man, it's almost as if she would say, rather than being the Queen of Sheba and being waited on hand and foot, I would almost rather be a doorkeeper in your house. Isn't that what David said to the Lord? The king of Israel, and he'd say, I'd rather be a servant in the house of the Lord than to be the king. I'd rather just be the doorkeeper, just to be able to be in your presence. And that's what she's saying. She's saying these people are just blessed to be here. And then she says this, notice this. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on his throne to be the king for the Lord your God, because your God has loved Israel to establish them forever. Therefore he made you king over them to do justice and righteousness. And she doesn't use a generic name. She says, blessed be, that's the Lord, L-O-R-D, capitalized in your Bible. It's the Yahweh, the name of God, your Elohim, which is the name for God. That triune God. She's saying, your God has blessed his people to put you as king, and bless him for putting you as king. She's blessing the Lord. And this is the whole thing. This is the whole thing. This woman comes and she listens to Solomon. She recognizes that it is because of God that he's there. And it's this point that she realizes this is the God I want to follow. This is the God that I want to serve. Blessed be the Lord who delighted in you, putting you on the throne. And that's beautiful. Jesus would say of this woman in Matthew chapter 12, verse 42, he said, the queen of the south, the queen of Sheba, will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. Matthew chapter 12, verse 42. Jesus would say that this woman is going to rise up and condemn that generation because she would travel all that way because she heard that there's a real God in Israel and there's a king who God has put on the throne who has the wisdom of God in him. And she would travel, as I said, 1,200 miles on caravan to find this guy with camels and all these servants, and she's going to come with 4,000 pounds of gold, and that's going to take a few guys to carry it, right? A few camels anyway. And she comes and she hears Solomon's wisdom and she receives it. She believes it. What Jesus is saying is she's going to be in that place where she can stand up. She got saved. And yet, one greater than Solomon is here. That's the beautiful thing, is Jesus doesn't make us come to Mecca and say, hey, you got to come out to Mecca. Or you have to come to Rome. Or you have to come to wherever, Utah, Salt Lake City. He comes to you. He comes to you. And I don't know where you got saved, but I got saved in my bedroom in Pocatello, Idaho. Downstairs. Nothing more humble than that. And you may have got saved in an airport. Or maybe you got saved in a church. Or maybe you got saved in your bedroom. But Jesus is there when you do. I don't know if you realize that, but man, he was there at that moment. The second you hit your knees, the second you bowed in your heart, Jesus was there for you. with His wisdom, with His grace, with His forgiveness. Man, Queen of Sheba, go all that direction, all that way, just to seek the true and living God. And that's the way it was back then, man. You had to go to Jerusalem, the place where God had put His name amongst His people. You know, they were to be a light to the world, but they weren't a very good light. Solomon was, though, because his wisdom spread all the way to her, and so she would come and check it out for herself. And so, too, when it comes to the gospel, man, we need to go and check it out for ourselves. If we haven't bowed our knee to Jesus yet, we need to go and listen for ourselves. I was talking to a young gal last night. She's probably not young by most people's standards, but I'm old, so she was pretty young. And she was talking about how for 32 years she was in Mormonism. And in that whole time, she said, I felt so sorry for people because I just thought, oh, everybody's so deceived. And then when she started to challenge the truth claims of Mormonism and just start to do some research and actually search things out, she found out, wait a minute. All the things that people that are against Mormonism are saying are actually true. And she was telling me last night, she said, you know, I didn't realize how wrong, how deceived I was. And it was the hardest thing in the world for her to come out of that. Why? Because she believed it was true and all of her family believed it was true. And so to reject that institution within her life meant leaving behind everything and everyone whom she'd ever trusted in. Man, that's a difficult decision to make. But sometimes we have to go to those extremes. But when we go to those extremes, Jesus is always there, isn't He? And He meets us there. You know, my wife went through something very similar when she was 17, coming out of the Mormon church. But this queen, you know, leaving behind her religions, leaving behind her gods, leaving behind her country, and leaving a little bit of money, verse 9. And she gave the king 120 talents of gold. That's 4.5 tons of gold. Spices, spices in great abundance, and precious stones. There never were any spices such as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And Ethiopia, of course, is known for its spices. And so she gives all these things to the king. And you know, I think that's interesting. She gives all to him. And that's the way that it is when we come to the King of Kings, isn't it? He doesn't ask for anything except for everything. And so we come to Him with our life. And we say, Jesus, you can have my life. Now, 4.5 tons of gold, that's pretty significant. What's 4.5 tons of gold compared to the life of a person? You know what's interesting is when we give Him our life, and you know, there's this dichotomy, I think, you know, this interesting dilemma that we have, because we know that we're sinful, we know that we're weak, we know that we're not worthy, we know that we're lowly. And to say, I am not a man but a worm, as some of the people in the Bible would say, is probably not a bad description if you really knew your own heart, if you're honest. And yet God sees you also created in the image of God. Somebody He died for, somebody of eternal worth and value. And so on our side, we know that we're getting a pretty good deal. Because we're going to exchange this messed up, wrecked, and ruined life for His abundant life. And so we give ourselves to Him. We offer ourselves a living sacrifice to God, which is the reasonable thing to do, it tells us in Romans chapter 1. It only makes sense. And that He gives us, as He says, come to me and I will give you life, and that more abundantly. Come, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your soul. Take upon my yoke, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. See, that's what Jesus gives us. He gives us that peace that passes understanding. He gives us all of these things. Somebody told me today they were praying that God would give me wisdom that passes understanding. I thought about that for a minute. Wisdom that doesn't make any sense? I think I already got that. Oh, whatever. But here she comes to the king for that. We go to the King of Kings and give all. And it says, verse 10, also the servants of Hiram and the servants of Solomon who brought gold from Ophir, brought algum wood and precious stones, and the king made walkways of the algum wood for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also harps and stringed instruments for the singers, and there were none such as these seen before in the land of Judah. And so here we see the Queen of Sheba gives gifts, others are giving Solomon gifts, and Solomon takes those things that are given to him and he makes beauty out of those things, makes instruments and makes beautiful steps up to the temple. He doesn't waste anything. He knows what to do. When he gets algum wood, I mean, what would you do with algum wood? I don't know. What's algum wood? He makes steps and he makes instruments. He knows what's going to work. And he makes all these things work for him. Verse 12, it says, and now King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, and much more than she had brought to the king. So she turned and went to her own country, she and her servants. And that's how it works. She gives Solomon all that she has, all that she brought for him. She was probably thinking, okay, we're going to see how this guy is. We're going to see if he's really worth his salt. Maybe we'll just give him this peacock. But when she sees who he is, she surrenders it all. All that 4 tons of gold, all those spices, she offloads everything. And in exchange, what does she get? Much, much more. And so too with us. We give everything. And what do we get back? Much, much more. Ethiopian tradition is that she returned with an exact replica of the Ark of the Covenant, which they believe they still have today, and a child from Solomon, which makes a lot of sense knowing that he had 1,000 wives. What's one more, right? But anyway, who knows? But we have a better exchange when it comes to God. We give this wrecked life for that abundant life. Verse 13, the weight of the gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. 666. That's an interesting number, isn't it? I mean, I don't know about you, but if I was Solomon, I'd be like, just bring 1 extra talent. Or 1 less. Don't you do that? You go up to the cash register. I mean, we're all a little bit superstitious when it comes to this number. I mean, being Christians, we've read Revelation chapter 13. We know what that's all about. No, we don't know what it's all about, but I don't want it to be this loaf of bread and that jug of milk and that candy bar. And so when I go to the store and it rings up and it comes up exactly 666, what are you doing? You're grabbing an impulse item. Well, throw this in there too, And the cash register, she knows. She's like, ooh. And she looks at you like suspiciously. Oh, throw this gum in there too, whatever. I don't know that this means anything, but it's definitely not good or bad. I don't know if it's bad, but it's definitely not good. Verse 14, besides what the traveling merchant and the traders brought, and all the kings of Arabia, and the governors of the country brought gold and silver to Solomon, and King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of hammered gold went to each shield. He also made 300 shields of hammered gold. 300 shekels of gold went into each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Now, I'm guessing these are shields, for decoration. I'm guessing that these aren't going into battle. Otherwise, he's going to have the most blinged out army in the world. But he's putting these in his palace. He has his palace, and he's putting them up on the walls, I'm guessing, as decoration. And this would be his summer palace. This is where he'd go up where it's a little bit cooler, go up to Lebanon and chill out during the hot Mediterranean summers. Verse 17, he says, moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory. Okay, just picture this. Now, I know today this is like, that's illegal. You know, you can't sell ivory or trade in ivory. That's not cool. You know, tusks of elephants or walruses or whatever. In fact, you know, I saw one in Alaska, and only the natives can sell them, and they have to be serial numbered. You know, it's like a big deal. You know, you can't just do ivory. Ivory's obviously not as plentiful as it was back then, but he builds his throne out of ivory. Can you imagine an ivory throne? Wouldn't that be beautiful? I mean, just the way the ivory carves. You know, I saw this carving in the side of the ivory, this tusk. They were selling it for like, it was like, he said it was the second longest tusk in the world. It was really long. And they were selling it for like $6,000 or something like that. Could you imagine a throne completely carved out of ivory? How beautiful that would be. White, beautiful ivory throne. And he overlaid it with pure gold. What? Now, I could see carve the thing out of cypress wood and then overlay it with gold. It's like, what are we going to do with all this excess gold? Cover the throne with it. The ivory throne? Yeah, might as well. I need a new color. It's crazy. I mean, it just shows you the ridiculous wealth of this. 18, the throne had 6 steps with a footstool of gold, which were fastened to the throne. There were armrests on either side of the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the armrests. 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the 6 steps. Nothing like it had been made for any other kingdom, no doubt. I mean, this is amazing. Just shows you how extreme all this was. Verse 20 says, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold. Of course, why use Tupperware when you can have gold vessels? And all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for that was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. Oh, a silver cup? Yeah, get that out of here. You know, we have that expression, you know, he grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. You know, silver was nothing in the days of Solomon. This is how wealthy it was. And it just goes on to explain why. Verse 29, for the king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Hiram once every 3 years. The merchant ships came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. I always think of that. Whenever I think of gold, I think of monkeys and apes. It's kind of a weird... he had a lot of exotic things. Peacocks, monkeys, all these things he brought from different places. You know, very, very wealthy, you know, and it's just bizarre. All these things that Solomon had. So verse 22, so King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom, and all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God put in his heart. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules, and a set rate year by year. So what this communicates is that the kings around Solomon, all the nations around him, were bringing him gold and coming to hear his wisdom. And what happened, so they would hear the fame of Solomon's wisdom, they'd come with a gift, and they would realize as they're listening to Solomon's wisdom, this man is so smart, there's no way we could ever conquer him. And so by surrender and virtue of the fact that he is so great, they just start to pay him tribute. Now, David had to conquer these nations and put them under tribute. These guys are voluntarily becoming vassals of his kingdom. Everybody's bowing down to Solomon because his wisdom is so great. If you think about it, it's phenomenal. And they're bringing all of these horses and armor and all this stuff year by year. They're giving this all to Solomon. And of course, God had told Solomon, remember, not to multiply horses, not to multiply wives. And Solomon has done both. They say that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. you know. And that's kind of what Solomon is experiencing. Verse 25, it says, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, and 12,000 horsemen who he had stationed in the chariot cities with the king at Jerusalem. This is a massive cavalry. It's hard to say, just because we're Calvary Chapel, I can't say that word, cavalry. Massive horse army for for the ancient world. I mean, massive. And Solomon had all the fame, all the money, all the wisdom, all the power, all the prestige and influence, and to boot 1,000 wives and thousands of horses. And his conclusion to his life, this is what he would say. Ecclesiastes 12:13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. So he just skipped to the end because he already said everything was vanity and he described it in detail. This is the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And that had to be a terrifying thought to Solomon. God's going to bring everything to light. Well, not for the Christian. No, for the Christian. Remember what Paul says, that we all must stand before the judgment seat of Christ, that our works will be judged, and everything will be brought to light, whether good or evil. Now, of course, we know as Christians that as we stand before the judgment seat of Christ and all those things are brought to light, it tells us that we're going to be rewarded for those things we did by faith, and everything else is going to be burnt up. Praise the Lord. Can't wait for the day to see those things burnt up. But everything's going to be brought to light. And Peter would say, what manner of men should we live, or what manner of men should we be, knowing that everything's going to burn? Puts it into perspective. For God brought you into this world, and it is true that you will take nothing out with you. You can only send things ahead. And it's those things you do by faith, those things you do as you seek the Lord and know the Lord, that are going to last for eternity. But it's not the things that you gather as you live on this earth. It says, so, verse 26, so he reigned over all the kings from the river of the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. The king made silver as common as in Jerusalem as stones, and he made cedar trees as abundant as sycamores, which are in the lowland. And he brought horses to Solomon, and they brought horses to Solomon from Egypt and from all the lands. So Solomon, a great man with great weaknesses. Verse 29, now the rest of the acts of Solomon, first and last, are they not written in the book of Nathan the prophet, the prophecy of Ahijah, the Shilonite, and the visions of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And so these are the, no doubt, the resources, some of the resources that they used to compile this record, and probably some of the things in 2 Kings as well concerning Solomon. Verse 30, it says, Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. And so 40 years of his reign, which means that he would be somewhere around 57 when he died. Not very old. All those women wore him out. Then Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. That's the reality of it. Nobody gets to take anything. And Solomon, with all this wealth, and he would even say this in Ecclesiastes, you work really hard your entire life to build something, and then it's given to somebody else who doesn't care about it. And so this life is vanity, except for what we do for the Lord. Everything we do in this life is going to burn, except for the things that we do for the Lord. And the quicker that we can learn to have that perspective, that life is about serving Jesus, life is about living for Jesus, life is about knowing Jesus, the sooner we can gain that perspective, the safer and the better off we are. And the more we live for ourselves, the more we get for ourselves and gather for ourselves, the more miserable we will be. And so just what a great reminder when we look at Solomon's life. Everybody wants to be that. Everybody wants to be wealthy and famous. But it's not what it's cracked up to be. Only knowing Jesus is what's going to satisfy us. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this time just to be able to look at Solomon's life. And what an amazing man. What a complex man. What a lost man at times. And yet it would seem at the end of his life he'd turn to you. He'd declare everything vanity. As he sought fame, as he sought fortune, as he sought wisdom, as he sought madness, as he sought all those things, he concluded that life was about you and knowing you and obeying you. And I pray that that would be the reality for each of us tonight. That we would see the importance of knowing you and obeying you and trusting you and following you, Jesus. That we would give ourselves to you, that we might receive back so much more in you. We love you and praise you, Lord. It's in Jesus' name we pray.